putting the X in success. Breaking down the barriers to affordable mental health support with Pluxee UK's Oliver Bridges and guest Pat Garland-Smith and Keith Osborne from Care First.
Welcome. I'm Oliver Bridges and I am the Head of Commercial Retention at Pluxee UK. And I am here today with our EAP partners, Care First. Keith is the head of business at Care First and Pat is the head of training. And today we're going to have a conversation and we're going to go through all the key subjects around trends, key facts, key information all around employee assistance programs, health and wellbeing, and general insight into what's happening within the market at the moment. Pat, I think whilst we sort of open up, whilst I have introduced you as the head of training, actually it's fair to say you're a lot more than that. Are you able to give us a bit of background on your experiences and what you're able to share today?
Yeah, my background's counselling and psychology, and I've been in practice for over 30 years now. At Care First, I don't actually do the counselling anymore, but I'm responsible for the training. So my role is going out to lots of different organisations and delivering mental health training.
Keith, thanks for coming today. So similar to Pat, from a head of business perspective, you also see challenges slightly from a different scope, but you see the trends that a lot of businesses are coming having conversations with you about at the moment.
Yes, Ollie. I mean, at the moment, there's an awful lot of businesses now that need our support. We've never been busier, and that's busier in terms of an operational side of things, from Pat and the counselling team to new business and developing and helping and supporting bespoke packages, really.
I recently read a stat that mental illness across the UK is attributed to 22% of all the illnesses that we are now seeing. If you compare that to various different things like cancer and cardiovascular, actually the mental health illnesses that we are seeing at the moment are much greater than even those, which to me is an absolutely shocking statistic. Pat, I think, from your perspective, you're seeing those trends a lot more and seeing what's starting to come through.
Yeah, absolutely. They say 1 in 4 people in their lifetime are going to experience some sort of mental ill health. And I think it's important to look at the difference between mental health and mental illness.
Yeah.
So, for example, mental health, we're talking about our day-to-day well-being.
Yeah.
And it can be affected by a poor relationship, lack of sleep, illness, any sort of thing at all that affects our day-to-day routine is called our mental health well-being, our mental well-being. And then you look at mental illness, which is a diagnosable illness such as depression or anxiety. And what we're seeing is more of that coming into play now, particularly since the pandemic. People are suffering from isolation and loneliness, causing depression or anxiety. All of those things are coming out now.
Yeah.
And you said about the stat between mental illness and physical illness.
Yeah.
And what we're looking at is really there should be no difference. We should class a mental illness in the same way as we class a physical illness.
Yeah.
But what we find, people talking to us at Care First will say, I had to phone in sick. I phoned in because I've got a migraine or a stomach upset. But that isn't really the reason. It's because I'm suffering from anxiety or depression and I don't want to talk to my line manager about it.
Yeah, I think I know we're going to go into detail about a couple of those key subjects. I think, some of the key stats that we saw, so I think it was 15.6% from a cancer perspective, 16.2% in relation to cardiovascular. But then when you attribute those that are much more common, they're not such a taboo subject,
Sure.
and then you go to 22% with regards to mental health, it's a shocking statistic. And I think, ultimately, Keith, I know you're able to give some context. We're seeing that grow and grow even further, and I guess you're seeing that on a day-to-day basis.
Yes, we are. But also, you've got to think those are just the reported cases. What about the people who have an illness such as depression or anxiety that don't even go to see a medical practitioner? So what you're talking about is the diagnosable illnesses that have gone forward for medical help.
Yeah.
But there are probably as many people experiencing depression, anxiety, or one of the more common mental illnesses who haven't yet sought medical advice.
Yeah, I think, one of the key or important areas that's subject at the moment is people talk about a mental health crisis. And I think at times people like to talk about things as a crisis, but I think it's, a genuine fact that at the moment, unless there's going to be a key change in the way in which people approach or support from a taboo area, I think ultimately it's fair to say that there is a crisis at the moment.
There is, and that crisis is not just because people are coming forward more, it's also because there aren't the resources in place. It takes a long time to get a psychiatric appointment, for example, or a psychiatric diagnosis. It takes a long time to see the right person for your mental illness. And also, geographically, you see a greater population in a certain area of the country to another. So access is depending where you live. You know, they talk about all the old postcode lottery, and that's absolutely right with mental illness. Depending where you are in the country, resources are lacking.
Okay. Keith, if I move on to you very quickly, from a stats perspective, what kind of engagement are you guys seeing, and what have you seen within the industry over the last year?
Yes, well, Ollie, I mean, it was 1.75 million people engaged with mental health services in June, up to June 23 last year, which is phenomenal. We look after 2,200 organisations. It's about 2.4 million people. That's a staggering amount. In terms of some of the data that we have from that, we get around about 750 calls a day coming in to support those 2.4 million people. So it is a huge situation.
I mean, when you're sharing those statistics, I think actually what that really resonates is that it's great that people are using the services, but coming back to you, Pat, I think whilst those statistics are huge and those numbers are huge, there are other providers in the market who I know we see similar, but those trends are that whilst we're seeing what the best part of 2 million people using service just via yourselves, actually what is the true number? And it's around, for me, the stigma. And again, if I move on to that, I think, you know, for me, if we look at the stigma, would you say that the stigma is improving with regards to mental health, or do you think it's still very much a taboo subject?
I think we really want to think the stigma is getting less, but we know from the mental health days that we run at Care First and the webinars we produce that many, many people, as I've said, are still too afraid to come forward. Now, it's helped when you get some of the pop stars, some of the footballers, even members of the royal family have spoken openly about how they felt following bereavement or how they suffer with anxiety or depression. And those people coming forward do actually help others to think, well, actually, if that footballer can say it, I can say it. Or if that boxer can say it, I can say it. So it does help. However, within the workplace, we still see a reluctance to come forward. Now, that could be because managers are afraid to have those conversations because they have a duty of care. And if I came to you, Ollie, and you were my manager and said, look, I'm living with depression, you would probably think, oh, God, what we've got to do now, you know, in terms of supporting this person. So I think managers are frightened to ask the questions. Some managers are frightened to ask the questions, and some employees are frightened to talk to their manager. So the stigma continues. Will I have promotion? People will think I can't cope with the job. I won't get anything interesting to do if I say I have a mental illness.
One of the key things that I was really interested to hear from yourself is people talk about the impact of the pandemic, and now we're talking about the cost of living crisis. I'm interested from both of your opinions, but I know, Pat, you were talking about that whilst people may assume that the pandemic is over, actually what people aren't realising is the longevity and the impact that had. And you were saying to me about the impact of loneliness, anxiety that's been caused. Again, not necessarily attributed to what would be wellbeing,
that's right.
but actually it's really important.
When we were delivering the webinars, we would see the questions at the end. You know, they would ask questions, and it was our job to answer those questions. And I would say the majority talked about, I feel lonely, I feel isolated. And then when it came time to go back to work, they were saying, I don't want to go back to work. It's a big place. I'm too scared now. You know, I don't want to see my colleagues again. I've been delivering my job wearing my pajamas, for example, and now I've got to go in all suited and booted. I don't want to do this anymore. So I think the after effect of the pandemic has started a pandemic of poor mental health, unfortunately. And it's how do employees support the person in terms of well-being within the organisation? And that's where we come in, isn't it, Keith?
Absolutely.
In terms of that?
I mean, we go back about usage. I mean, year on year, growth has happened since the pandemic. I think that that's a sign that people are walking towards the help, as everything that Pat has said. I think that actually shows that it's a positive step and a sign of strength rather than weakness. But I do think the impartiality of having an independent EAP allows people the thought of confidentiality, being able to phone up, speak to somebody independently. You might have an awful lot of people who mean well within organisations, but don't forget they've got their own jobs to do in HR or line management. And then this sort of fringe thing of looking after someone's mental health. And I think that probably that sort of saying of a little bit of information can be dangerous. You're dealing with professionals and dealing with people who can actually help and get the correct care pathway, and that's so important. And that impartiality, take it away from work, depersonalise it a little bit, and that's where you get the real traction.
And I think people think when they phone Care First, they have to talk about a work-related issue. But I would say the majority of people who phone Care First are not talking about a work-related issue. They're talking about a personal issue. And that could be a bereavement or an illness, or they're worried about finance. And we get that a lot, the financial issues at the moment with the cost of living crisis. And then they say, oh, and now my manager has asked me to do this. And it's almost the final straw. So I think people phone Care First to talk about a personal issue. And yet the idea is actually we phone about a work-related issue, and that really isn't the case.
I think everything you said there is incredibly valid. I think, where you talk about cost of living especially, one of the specialisms that we have with Pluxee UK as part of our partnership with yourselves is we support functions across everything with regards to cost of living. And actually when we work with yourselves and we partner and supply, our EAP packages in across all of our clients, ultimately, as a combination, you say, we've got the best part of 500-600 clients as a relationship at the moment. And actually, it's really important that we heighten that trend. However, one of the trends that I'm seeing, or certainly we're seeing a lot more, is where do companies prioritise how they spend? So where you talk about from a cost of living crisis, that the anxiety that's causing for employees, it's very much seen actually with suppliers, with our clients, that actually, combined, where do they prioritise? How do they spend their money? What is a priority? Do they spend it on X amount? Do they spend it on salary increases? Do they spend it on an employee assistance program? Where can they make the most of their money? And I think for us, what's becoming really clear, and actually it's a really difficult thing to almost articulate, in the fact that, having an EAP service in amongst of everything that certainly we do within our package actually can be really quite cost effective for a business. And you might not, that certainly a company will not approach us to speak to us in a way that, they're not doing it to save money, but actually the reality of it is, whilst it is incredibly important that they have an extensive program, that, we work with you guys for a reason, on the flip of that, actually there is a cost-effective element to it. And I know, Keith, you've got a couple of stats that attribute to that. I think, what is it? There's a key one around, is it for every pound or something like that? Yeah,
I mean, every pound that is spent, you get £8 returned. I mean, and that is through absence management, people who are then working more effectively, so they're not working unwell, they're working effectively all of the time, so therefore producing more return for the organisation. Don't forget, there's also an element, you talk about why you should do this. It's war on talent. Within UK PLC at the moment, there's an awful lot of problem with companies recruiting the right people. Well, now this becomes a package which is the norm, where before it was a luxury item. People are expecting that because people are more tuned in of everything that Pat was saying and the data we gave earlier around people's need for mental health support. So therefore, people are expecting this. So put it in place. It's a low cost, and the return is £1 spent, £8 return. And that's based around absenteeism. 69% of all absenteeism long-term is related to mental health. Short-term, and that's over 4 weeks. Short-term, under 4 weeks, is 39%. That's a staggering amount. That is a big cost to the businesses.
I think, we've seen stats at the moment that mental health across absenteeism, illness, sickness, whatever way you want to spin that, costs over 100 billion to organisations.
Yeah, absolutely.
100 billion in a year.
And I think the other thing about that is looking at duty of care as well. Why would you not have an EAP? If your focus is your staff and the wellbeing, why would you not have an EAP? I think that's the thing, because we know that an organisation has a duty of care for its staff. We know a manager has a duty of care for its staff, but the individual has their own duty of care, and that's to keep themselves well and healthy, not just physically, but emotionally. So if they know there's an EAP in place, they can just ring and say, I'm struggling with this or this. And what we say is, don't leave it until you've got lots of issues. Phone at the first issue and get that in the moment support from one of the qualified counsellors. Get on the phone and say, I'm struggling with this, how can you help? And look after yourself, really.
And I think, if we had a layer to that, you know, when we're sharing some of those stats, I think what is also really important is that EAP doesn't become a tick box exercise.
Absolutely.
And actually,
Absolutely.
the biggest part of what we do as part of our relationship, our partnership, and how we service is having what I would deem as an effective EAP.
Absolutely.
So not that tick box exercise, not that having a phone line, actually having an effective EAP. And again, I know we'll come on in a bit around some tips around how potentially what we would do necessarily as a workplace to sort of engage with EAP, but having that effective EAP is incredibly important. Now, the caveat with that is there may be charges associated to it, right? And the levels of quality and the levels of service. However, when we start to reiterate some of the facts that you're saying, Keith, you know, reiterating and going again, 100 billion, right? 100 billion in a year on the basis of absenteeism, sick, people not wanting to talk, you know, general costs to an organisation. It's really important that people engage in a really effective employee assistance programme, and make sure that that encompasses everything that is part of, you know, we work from a wider employee benefits programme. It needs to be a house and a real home of that service and what we can deliver. Again, we'll come on to some more key stats. I think for me, you know, Keith, you were also talking about the issues with the NHS at the moment and the time pressures around that. I know we've mentioned around being able to service that level. I know it is a challenge within the industry also with regards to getting fully qualified counsellors, and that's something where there's a lot of focus happening there at the moment. And again, Pat, you'll be able to share a bit of context on that. But with the NHS, you're getting a lot of feedback on the waiting times associated to that as well.
Absolutely. I mean, I think we're all very familiar, and the poor old local GPs, it's taking over a week to get to actually speak to a GP, and that's after you've gone through a triage. And then once you get to that point there, their solution is to either throw medication at it, or if you need to speak to somebody who is going to provide you with some counselling service, which is what's needed, rather than putting you on some medication, we're talking months. With what we do here, the in-the-moment support, people phone up, they'll speak to a counsellor. The counsellor then will take them through a clinical assessment. And if it's deemed that structured counselling is the right course of action and the right care pathway for them, then they'll be having counselling, 6 sessions of counselling with one of our qualified counsellors within 5 days. That appointment's made within 48 hours. Anxiety is relieved immediately, rather than this stress of waiting for the NHS letter to come through with your appointment. And that's a real problem. And you've got people then are suffering, and you're actually adding to their anxiety and their issues rather than solving them. I mean, I think Pat said earlier, the quicker we can get to people to try and unpack their problems, the better it is. The longer it gets pushed down, the deep-rooted it has as a problem, and therefore harder to unravel, and the more damage it's causing to the individual.
We know with the right intervention and the right early intervention, recovery is very possible. You know, it's not just about talking. It's not just about medication. It's a combination of thinking, do you know what? I've reached out for help and it was there. And it was there at 2 o'clock in the morning, the same as it's there at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And I think that's important for people to know. We're there 24/7. The manager isn't. The GP isn't. But you can speak to a qualified counsellor.
Absolutely agree in what you're saying. I think, you know, when you look at it, it's really important that that service is available at all times, and anything that a company can do to put any sort of prevention in place where they are being taken or taken care of or being looked after over a 24/7 period is so important. And like you say, you know, it is certainly not there to just solve that. There might be elements where, you know, someone needs further medication or further advice, but actually having that advice in place to even as an initial prevention could be the difference between, you know, making the difference to one individual. And again, when you look at companies and the effectiveness of how they run and manage those, that is so important. And we've certainly seen that with some of the schemes that we've run together.
And we work in a solution-focused way. So when the person phones through, the counsellor usually says, so what's led you to ring us today? What is it you're actually coming to us to talk about? And that helps the person to think that through. And then the next question is, well, what options are available to you? Can you talk to a manager? Do you have a family member to support? Is there a GP you can go to? And then we ask them, well, what sort of outcomes do you want to achieve? And how can we help you do that? So it's very proactive. They might be guided towards some help ideas, sort of online help things. They might be guided to telephone counselling or face-to-face counselling, or go to the GP, and they will give them almost a piece of homework. So when you phone next week, have you seen the GP by then? What do you need to do? So it's us being very proactive to help the individual. They don't just phone us, I can't do this anymore, and we have to manage that. We actually help them find their own solution.
I think you touched on a really important point there, in the fact that actually there is not a one-size-fits-all approach to everybody.
Not. And that's why we're unique, is that we will model a service to the need. And I think that's what makes... And we're not just counsellors. People say, it's just counselling. But there's training, there's information. And because we work in the same building with our counsellors, if there's a problem upstairs, they'll come and say, we've had a lot of calls from this particular organisation. Is there something going on? And likewise, if someone phones us and says, we've had a bereavement in our organisation, can you let your counselling teams know? We can go and say, look out for this. There might be an increase of calls. And we can manage those calls effectively by staffing up to meet the crisis. So that's why we're all working together to do that, really.
Yeah, I think, if I look at examples, for me personally, for the partnership that we've had, if we look at some of the clients that we've worked with recently, it's amazing to me how much difference that has been made. But that one-size-fits-all approach is so important that it is not. We need that variation.
Absolutely.
You need those tools.
Yeah.
You talk about the different types of therapy available, different types of approach. One of the key areas at the moment is around, we talk about menopause.
Absolutely.
Menopause, such a taboo subject, and actually even as a male, I have females who work in my team who ultimately, would never have spoken or approached me about this kind of stuff. And you're smiling because you're probably thinking, oh God, are we going down? But it's really interesting because actually, what's become really apparent to me is how important subjects like that
Absolutely.
are. And, if I look at my own personal experience as a manager, how do I have those conversations with individuals?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm smiling because as a woman who has been through the menopause, there was none of that support for me. And my generation, we just went through it because that's what you did. Whereas now at least you can have that conversation with a little more ease than you might have done 15 years ago or whatever.
Yeah, and I think, again, you come back to that effective EAP, the services that we work on together and we provide, actually, that enhancement that I know that Care First have invested in from a menopause perspective is so important. And actually the interest that we are seeing, it has been brilliant. So again, we're picking out these taboo subjects, but it just fascinates me, that and it's really pleasing to see how it's improving, and how I 100% agree with what you're saying. So there is certainly stigma there. There are certainly managers who are not comfortable. However,
And I think the woman isn't comfortable either.
Absolutely.
Me coming to you and saying, this is happening, would be quite daunting. And 15 years ago, you wouldn't have said it at all, whereas at least now you can have a conversation.
But that's everything we're saying. That's gone from mental health discussions to then menopause, and then where next? And that's going to carry on going. So we've got to be reactional and listen to the river all the time and make those changes.
Absolutely.
And themes and trends come and go. But, the things we're getting through is exactly all the things that we've talked about.
Yeah, and you've led me on quite nicely, because the theme that we're working on at the moment over the next 6 months is around affordability. So you may look at affordability and go, how does employee assistance programs work under an affordability theme? So that leads me really nicely on to the topic of absenteeism. So again, when we talked about that affordability piece, there is an investment required to have an effective EAP. It's really important. We're starting to get through the reasons why, and hopefully that's becoming more and more clear. I think the other side to that, though, is, how can you justify, if you need to justify, the investment? And actually, where we look at absenteeism, particularly, a stat that I've seen recently is that absenteeism on average has gone from 5.8 days a year per individual to 7.8 days a year. Again, when you start to build that out to an organisation who has 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 employees, you're talking an extra 6,000 days if we're using 3. That's huge, right? Absolutely. The cost of that is huge. But Keith, I wanted to lean on you because I know you've got a great example of where you've worked with, I believe, an academy trust recently, where you focused specifically on that. Are you able to share some more details?
Yeah, of course, Ollie. I mean, I think it's an example of coming up with a bespoke package. So I onboarded a large academy trust, had around about 7,000 employers across 22 different schools. We worked with their HR department, and we established spikes in terms of absenteeism and when they occurred. Perfect storm. Teachers have 6 weeks off through the summer holidays. And then around about week 9 to week 12, they all start struggling with their burnout, mental health. The perfect storm, isn't it? Long time off, straight back into it, and the busiest time. So then we started thinking, well, what can we do to put in some intervention? And we did this as a pilot last year, but we started it in August, and we actually started doing return to work and actually some webinars and seminars and some touch-based sessions through August. And we actually got, surprisingly, there was a few that didn't spend the whole time on the beach and come along to those webinars, learnt it, understood it, and then throughout the whole of September, we buddied people up, and again, more webinars, more awareness, getting people to focus on it, some of the coping mechanisms that we put in place that Pat has talked about earlier. And then through this period of, fingers crossed, through that vulnerable period of those weeks, has it gone down? And actually, it went down by 2.3% in terms of absenteeism based around mental health. Yeah. That's an effective EAP. That's looking at the problem and using all of our skills and experience to bring in intervention. Now, if you were to think about that, that's one academy. I don't know how many academies there are in the country, huge amounts. But don't forget, replacement of teachers is hard. They're under pressure, like NHS are under pressure. And then getting a cover teacher coming in, the cost of that's ginormous. Then the inconsistency for the kids in terms of their teaching ability. So that's what we can do and how we can try and implement something bespoke to organisations.
Yeah, and I think, you look at that, and then you look at that alongside the other mechanics that we also have with regards to what we can provide. As a partnership, we're seeing a huge trend, particularly in education. There's an awful lot of news in the media around teachers at the moment, around, trying to, and a lot of it is attributed to cost of living and all of that type of piece. That education piece, that example you've shared is so important. But what's really, really key for me in that is there's a couple of areas that I know made it a success. First and foremost, there was a culture, right? So they built the right culture. They built a culture where they pushed that success. They pushed those resources were available. They wanted to make sure that actually people had access to that and were made very well aware. And then actually the organisation themselves were really engaged. Like you talk about the costs of backfilling, and again we'll come on to recruitment. But when you build all of that out, it just shows that we can provide the best effective solution possible. But actually, where we're highlighting some of these examples, it has to work both ways. There has to be an investment. Us as providers can certainly be in the market and try and offer the best support and advice, but there has to be an engagement strategy within that. And I know probably leads me on quite nicely for yourself, Pat. I know you're extremely passionate that I think the famous phrase is EAP is not a tick box exercise.
Absolutely. I think there's something else we've missed here as well, Ollie. I heard what Keith was saying there, but you also have to look at the organisations where people don't get sick pay. So within education, there is still that option for people to get sick pay. But in lots of companies, there's no way someone would go off sick with a mental illness because they know they wouldn't be paid. Whereas if they have a physical illness, you've got a bad back, you've got a bad leg, people can usually see that and say, actually, yes, let's give them a bit of help. But if you've got a mental illness, it's not always seen. And so they may not get a sick pay, and that's keeping people in work when perhaps they shouldn't be. But what we say is, let's get them healthy to be in work. And as you said, it's not a tick box. It's so much more than, there's a phone line, use it if you need it. It's about active promotion. It's about what Keith said about the webinars. The service managers at Care First work closely with the organisations. What do you need in your organisation? We need webinars on this, or we need something on that. And it's up to the service manager to arrange that. We also deliver the training. We can deliver mental health training, anything like that. It's not just, it's counselling. It's far more than that.
I think I absolutely agree with you. I think one of the trends that I see at the moment, and it's really tricky to challenge a client on this, is we'll often go and present MI, so management information. And as part of that management information, we'll go or speak to them and go, the engagement's been really low. And they go, great, no one's got a problem. Actually, we're not saying that we want to drive ridiculous levels of usage. That's obviously, not what it's there for. But at the same time, again, it's not a trophy if people aren't using it. We want to make sure people are using services for the right reasons.
Absolutely.
But there is, with the stats and some of the information that we've shared today, it is really clear that if you're receiving 1% engagement, then you're not attributing the full aspect of what you should be getting out of your service. And again, that comes back for me to this tick box exercise, that actually there has to be a middle ground, there has to be a promotional element to it.
Absolutely.
But you link that back to our affordability theme. There are tangible results that can be put against it.
Yep.
So, there are benefits for everybody. Coming on further to that, you then talked about the recruitment piece. So where you were talking about the need and the high costs if we're using education with regards to trainee teachers or replacement teachers, actually workplaces full stop. So you talk about construction industry or, traditionally is what you'd be alluding to. Yeah. At times, if you've got a proportion of individuals off, they might not be getting paid.
Absolutely.
On the flip of that, there might be a skill shortage, which again we're seeing across as a theme at the moment. All of a sudden that slows a project down. The costs attributed to that, delays in projects, all of that is so significant. And I think, again, what I'm seeing within the industry that we're working on at the moment is there is an expectation for employees, when they're looking at who they're working for, what do their morals stand for? You talk about the culture, you talk about the build-up of what it means to go and work for that organisation. Do they talk about it? Is it a taboo subject? Are you okay to go and talk to your manager? At times it's not always fair, because a manager shouldn't necessarily be an expert employee in wellbeing and counselling. But having those services there to be able to support them are so important.
But I think, Ollie, when we talk about uptake and usage, having the right culture in the business is so important to encourage the promotion of it. We look at our 2,200 organisations we support, and we can... Probability is probability in data. So as one organisation getting 12% penetration within our service and others getting 2%, we're still providing the same amount of material, but actually culturally they haven't changed within their business to make it more accessible, because it's not going to go away. So what you've got is 10% of your population just suffering in silence, because we talked earlier, 1 in 4 people will struggle with mental health. Well, why has that disappeared down in terms of how many people will use the service? And it comes down to them not knowing about it. And that's poor, but if we keep on nudging people about the service and what we can do, and we have an engaged organisation like that academy that really does want to make the difference, then you've got an effective EAP, you've got an effective mental health programme, and that's so important. And we look at organisations that have low penetration. That's not a success. You're just hiding the problem. And ultimately, as you say, heads will be lost out of the workforce through absenteeism, which could be business critical. You actually have a couple of organisations that we look after with only 25, 30 people in it. And you have, 20% of those off with mental health. That's business critical.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as you build that out, there's an awful lot we could cover within sort of this period of time. And actually, I know one of the things that people will see over time is, our partnership's really key. It's really important part of what Pluxee do. We're so engaged and built into this as a foundation of whatever we're going to be doing moving forward. We're going to have opportunities to do more sessions like this, and I think for me there'll be key subjects that we pick out and go through, but what I wanted to sort of take us through today is that journey and some of those key stats. And listen, if we in this short period of time can get anyone thinking or resonating that actually we should be considering it more, or we want to approach and understand as to how can we engage more with our employees, what more can we be doing, then I think that for us is a great use of time today.
And that thing about the tick box is true, because as I said, we're not just about counselling, we support managers too. And when I go in, I say to the managers, do you know how to access Care First? Because instead of an employee coming to you as a manager and the manager saying, have you got the leaflet, go and give them a call, the manager needs to know how the system works too. So they say, let's get the laptop out, let's have a look at what this organisation does to support you. This is how you access this, and the manager can be more proactive too. So it's not just about us going out and sticking a leaflet in somewhere, or a poster. It's about saying to the manager, how do you use it? So when your people come to you, you don't just give them a leaflet or say phone the organisation. You can actively show them how to do it. And you can also make a phone call on their behalf, and lots of managers don't know that.
I think as well, it's important to say as well that EAP is not just about emotional support. We provide practical advice and guidance. A long time ago, we established that lack of control can cause anxiety. So if you were worried about your house being repossessed or your car being taken away, you're falling behind in payments, causes anxiety, which then becomes a mental health problem for us to solve. So we now actually also provide advisors that can give financial and legal support, takes away that anxiety, gets the control back, therefore that goes away. They work together, so a telephone information specialist can pick up that this person's showing signs of anxiety, put them through to a counsellor, solve that problem. The other way round, maybe somebody's being supported because of a bereavement, but then has concerns and worries around about what happens with inheritance tax. So then they put them through to a telephone information specialist. And again, off it goes. So you just put out these fires and help people through the situation they're in.
Yeah, brilliant. I think, from a subject point of view, there's one last question that I want to ask you, but sort of before I wrap that up, what I want to kind of reiterate is, the partnership that we have, the experiences that we're starting to build out. I think, for anyone listening to the podcast today, if they have any questions, if you want to reach out, if you want any advice, just reach out. That's what we're here for. We want to have those conversations. I think tangibly, I think it's really clear that, and hopefully people will see this today, is we care as individuals, but actually, as businesses working in collaboration together, we really care about the service that we're providing. So I think, if anyone isn't getting what they need or would like further advice, whether that be differentiates like we covered from a menopause point of view, people might not associate that with an EAP service. Very similar to what you were saying, Keith, with bereavement, everything else. If anyone wants to reach out and have a conversation, then absolutely, if we can speak to one person additional today, we might make that difference. Just finally, I wanted to say a huge thank you to you both today, just for your time, for your conversation, for your input, insight. It's been absolutely fantastic. I'll have one last question for you. I think I already know the answer, but I want to gauge your opinion. What I want to know is, can a workplace or can a workforce afford to not have an EAP solution in place for their employees?
Simple answer is no.
Absolutely. Definitely not.
I think what we really wanted to get across today was, when we're attributing, people overseeing or the cost of an EAP service, actually you might be surprised it's not as expensive as you think. And actually, where we talked about those stats around absenteeism, around recruitment, you made a great point around people not being paid sick leave, all of this stuff. Actually, when you attribute and put that number together very quickly, having an effective EAP is not as cost it's not as expensive, as you might think. So I think I completely agree with you, and hopefully it leaves something with someone to think about. Listen, thank you for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure. I'm really hopeful that we can do this again in the coming months. Let's reflect on what we've talked about today. Let's see what happens, and we'll come back and share further insight. But I just wanted to close out by saying thank you to those that have listened. Thank you to those that hopefully will get involved, and we look forward to seeing who else joins for the next episode of Putting the X in Success for Pluxee UK. Thanks. Bye.
Join us next time to discover how Pluxee UK is putting the X in success, enhancing employee engagement and making life at work more joyful.